Hello, and welcome to this year's first program from the Seasonably Good series, which takes a look at different produce when it's in season locally and what we can do with it to enjoy it immediately and to preserve it for later. This program's topic is berries and cherries. The berry season is beginning already. Local strawberries are available now in the farmers markets and maybe even in the grocery stores. And soon we'll see cherries and blueberries followed by raspberries and black raspberries. This chart gives you an idea of the central Pennsylvania fruit season. Obviously, things can vary a bit depending on the weather. Winter and early spring and summer weather can impact the harvests, both how long they last and when they start. But we are seeing strawberries now, so you could have some strawberries from the local farmers market already, or even from your own garden that you want to start doing some things with. We're going to do a cooking demonstration since this program is from my kitchen, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit about how to prepare your berries and cherries for eating, freezing, and cooking and baking. No matter what kind of berries and cherries you're using, you want to be careful with them because all of these fruits are very sensitive. They tend to retain a lot of pesticides and other chemicals, even after a very good rinsing and washing. So you really don't want to use any harsh chemicals to wash your berries and cherries. Even a dish soap that might have perfume or dye in it could retain those perfumes and dyes, and you'll end up ingesting them, and that's not necessarily the healthiest thing to do. What's recommended for produce in general, and especially for more sensitive produce like berries and cherries, is to wash with vinegar and water solution. 50% vinegar, 50% water, and rinse it thoroughly. About 20 seconds, run it under the tap for about 20 seconds before you eat it, freeze it, or cook it. You also want to make sure that you don't wash your berries or cherries right away because that can help to increase the mold and bacteria possibilities. You want to wait until you're ready to use them to wash them. And in the meantime, store them in a cool, dry place to prevent the molds and bacteria. I also recommend that even if you're not going to start eating them right away, when you get them home from the market or get them out of your garden, you check for mold and other potential bad spots and either use or discard the fruit that might have those spots immediately. Certainly separate them from the rest of the fruit to prevent the other fruit from getting contaminated. The other thing that's recommended, it's not necessarily if you're just going to eat or cook or bake immediately, but if you're going to freeze, it's also helpful to pat your fruit dry after you've rinsed it to prevent freezer burn and ice collecting on the fruit. A quick note about raw produce and COVID-19. The good news is that food seems to be relatively safe. Obviously, we want to be careful about how we handle containers and how we handle anything that we get from the grocery store or takeout anywhere that other people have been, since this is really a virus that is transferred among different animals through the air. COVID-19 can, of course, stay on surfaces, so you want to be careful about that. But the CDC's guidelines do not actually change the way that you should prepare your produce in COVID-19. Basically, the recommendation is that you wash your hands thoroughly, so soap and hot water for at least 20 seconds before you clean your produce. I would also say it's probably a good idea to wash your hands again after you have prepped the produce. And the main thing is don't be touching your face with your hands while you're prepping the produce, just in case there might be something on it, not just COVID-19, but anything else that might be on the fruit. Avoid touching your face until you've washed your hands thoroughly after you've handled your fruits and your berries. I already mentioned avoiding those harsh chemicals. We might be a bit more inclined right now to use things like bleach and other solutions to really clean things well. But with your produce, especially the berries and cherries, don't do that. You're going to end up ingesting it and you might get sick from it. So just use that 50-50 vinegar and water solution and you should be good to go. Just show you one quick thing here. I have some organic fruit here. These are organic blueberries that I got at the grocery store. Because these are organic, as well as the strawberries that I got at the farmer's market, I only soaked these for about 5 minutes in the vinegar and water solution, and then I rinsed them for about 20 seconds. However, I also have these cherries, which I got from the grocery store. They are from California, but they are probably grown with pesticides because they are not marked organic. So I actually soaked these for 20 minutes in the vinegar and water solution. There are some studies that have shown that soaking your produce in vinegar and water for 20 minutes or so helps to remove pesticides. It won't remove all of them, but it will help to remove some of them. So I don't wash my my organic produce as long as I wash the conventional produce, because with organic, you really just need to make sure that it's generally clean. But when you want to try and get rid of the pesticides, that 20 minutes is the better way to go. So those fruits are now ready to freeze, and I can put them in some kind of container that is freezer safe. I like to use Ziploc bags. I have some blueberries here that I actually froze last summer. I still have a couple of bags of those left that I will eat in the next several weeks, probably with my breakfast. I've also pulled them out through the year to bake occasionally, to make baked oatmeal or blueberry muffins. You can do anything that you would do with your fresh berries, you can do with them when they're frozen. So this is how I like to freeze my berries. I freeze most of my local produce in the Ziploc bags because it takes up less space, but any kind of freezer safe storage is fine. A Pyrex container, any kind of plastic container that seals properly. Just make sure that you pat that fruit dry before you put it in the freezer. And you should eat it within a year. These are from last August, so they're reaching the 10-month point, and we're getting close to the new blueberry season, so I will definitely finish those up in the next several weeks. It's very easy to freeze your berries. I freeze more blueberries than anything because I eat more of them simply because they're so healthy. I do freeze cherries sometimes, although the cherry season here has been not so great the past several years. One thing to think about with cherries is you may want to consider pitting them before you freeze them. It's not a requirement, but the thing to keep in mind is that all fruit softens, as with any other food. It softens when you freeze it and defrost it. So cherries are actually messier to pit after they've been defrosted. So you might want to think about pitting your cherries before you freeze them, unless you're really just freezing them because you like to snack on them and you don't mind eating them with the pits. But if you do like I do and you pull them out to eat in yogurt for breakfast or to bake with them, then I would say it might be a good idea to pit them first. Any cherries that I will freeze from this batch, I will definitely pit for convenience. So for our cooking demonstration today, we're going to make some freezer jam. There are many things you can do with your fruit that will allow you to store it for a longer term. You can obviously can your fruit. which is certainly more time consuming and tedious. We're not going to talk about that at all today. There are certainly plenty of programs and instructional videos out there on that. Today, what we're going to focus on is things that you can do that will allow you to enjoy it right now, or that will allow you to freeze it for longer term. Most things that you would do with your fruit, you can freeze: baked goods, sauces, anything like that. So we're going to talk about some recipes that you can enjoy now with your local berries and cherries, and that you can even freeze for later. We'll make some freezer jam with strawberries. And if you'd like to follow along and make your own through this video, then here are the things that you're going to want to have with you. You're going to need some berries or cherries, 2 cups. That's about a quart. You're also going to need some lemon juice, some kind of sweetener. You'll need pectin and some water. And if you don't have any pectin, but you do have chia seeds, I do have a recipe that allows you to substitute chia seeds instead of pectin. So that would be an option as well. If you don't have these things ready to go, but you're going to follow along in the video, then you can pause it and come back, because now we're going to move on to starting the process of making the jam. So first, I'll get the recipes here on the screen so that you can see what you need. So here are 2 freezer jam recipes that we're going to look at. I am going to make the one on the right, the low sugar freezer jam recipe, because I have a box of pectin. It's Pomona's pectin. This particular kind of pectin allows you to use a lower amount of sugar or other kinds of sweeteners like maple syrup or honey. You can also use pectin that is more like a regular pectin that requires a higher amount of sugar, and that's the recipe on the left, the regular freezer jam recipe. It doesn't matter what you use, it's just a matter of preference. Just make sure that you read the packaging and make sure that you're using the right kinds of sweeteners and the right amounts of sweeteners. The recipe on the left that calls for 4 cups of sugar assumes that you're using a pectin that requires a high amount of sugar. Whereas the low sugar freezer jam is Pomona's pectin, or there are other brands of pectin that also are low sugar pectins. You could use those as well. So before we get started, there are a couple of things you'll want to make sure that you've done. Regardless of what you're going to make here with me, I'm making the one with Pomona's pectin, but you can also follow along. I will have both of the recipes up on the screen. Either way, you're going to want to prep a little bit before we get started, because I'm ready to go and we'll get started right in on the cooking. I've already prepped my fruit. So you'll want to make sure that you've got your 2 cups of crushed fresh berries, or if you have cherries, that you've pitted them and you've chopped them. Get your other ingredients ready to go so that they're handy. And if you are making the jam with a regular kind of pectin that calls for sugar, you'll want to also mix the sugar with the fruit in a bowl and let it just sit for about 10 minutes. If you are making the pectin, the Pomona's pectin variety, then you're going to want to make your calcium water. And what you need to do for that is you're going to have 2 packets in your Pomona's pectin box. You're going to have a small packet that is your calcium powder, and you'll have a larger packet that is your pectin. You'll want to take the smaller calcium packet and measure out 1/8 of a teaspoon of the calcium and mix it with 2 tablespoons of water. You'll want to do this in a container that has a lid, like a glass jar, or some kind of plastic container. I've used an old honey jar. You just put the two into the container together and you shake it up with the lid on. And once it's fairly well shaken and mixed, you can just set it aside. If this is the recipe you're making, once you've done that, you're ready to go. And if you're making the regular freezer jam recipe and you've got your berries mixed with your cherries, or your berries or your cherries mixed with your sugar, then you are ready to go. Otherwise, until you've got those things ready to go, I would recommend pausing the video momentarily. Okay, so hopefully you have your fruit and maybe your calcium water ready to go. As you can see, I have crushed up my berries. I haven't crushed them very fine. I like my jam to be a bit chunky. You can run your berries or your cherries through the food processor or blender. I recommend that you be very careful because you don't want to puree it or liquefy it. You really just want your berries to be crushed or your cherries to be chopped. It depends on how fine you like your fruit to be in your jams. Basically mash it or chop it up to the consistency that you prefer. Because we're not actually cooking the fruit, it is not going to cook down at all in these recipes. That's not the case with the chia seed recipe, which I will also show you. But with either of these pectin jam recipes, whatever consistency, size, and texture you have the fruit at when you add everything, that's what it's going to be. It will soften a bit maybe in the fridge or freezer over time, but it's not going to break up like it would if you cooked this jam for canning. So here I have both of the recipes. I will be using the ingredients and instructions for the low sugar freezer jam on the right, but you can easily follow along. Most of the steps are fairly similar. So here I have my strawberries, and I have just added 3/4 of a cup of agave syrup. That's my sweetener of choice since I'm using Pomona's pectin. And I've added the lemon juice, and now I'm just going to stir them together with a wooden spoon along with the berries so that they're well mixed. And now they'll be ready to add the pectin and the calcium water. If you're making the regular pectin freezer jam recipe, you've already mixed your sugar and your berries, so you are ready to go with the pectin, and that's the step that we're going to do next. First, no matter which recipe you're making, you're going to want to boil some water, 3/4 of a cup for regular pectin and 3 ounces for the low sugar Pomona's pectin. And I'm going to go ahead and get the water boiling. And once my water has boiled, I will resume the video. So I recommend that you also pause the video until you have your water boiling. And then once your water starts to boil, you can add in your pectin and you can start to stir it. And in both cases, we're basically going to keep our pectin and boiling water on the stovetop for 1 minute before we remove it and turn the burner off. So go ahead and get your water boiling. I'm going to do that. Okay, so I have boiled the water, added for the Pomona's pectin 1/2 tablespoon of pectin, and I stirred constantly for 1 minute, allowing it to continue to boil for that minute, and then I removed it from the stove top. And you can run this through a blender or a food processor because you do get lumps, I broke it up basically as much as possible by hand and used a whisk because my blender and food processor both have plastic cups, and I'm just a little bit cautious about hot water and plastic because of the potential for releasing chemicals from the plastic. So since this needs to stay warm and go straight into the berry mixture, I instead just broke it up by hand using a spoon, pressing it against the side of the pot. And now it's ready to go into the jam mixture. So I am just going to add it in with the jam. Mix it with the berries, and use a spatula to get enough of the pectin. Make sure that you get all of the pectin out of the pot using a spatula. And then stir it in with the berries. So I'm stirring in the pectin, and you'll notice as you stir, it should start to gel for you. It won't gel very fast, but over time you should feel it start to thicken as the pectin mixes in with the berries or your cherries. And then once that happens and the pectin is well mixed in, if you are using the regular freezer jam recipe, then you just had the one part from the pectin, and that was to add the packet of pectin from your box. And so you are ready to go. You can just go ahead and put your fruit into containers for storage. Just make sure that if you're going to freeze any of your jam, that you allow a 1/2 inch at the top, because it will expand a bit when you freeze it. So my pectin looks like it's mixed in, and since I am using the Pomona's pectin, I have the additional step of adding 2 tablespoons of calcium water. So I have already measured out my 2 tablespoons. If you're doing this recipe, go ahead and measure it. You probably have that much, but you don't want to go over. So just go ahead and measure and make sure that you're using only 2 tablespoons. If you have a sufficient amount left over, you could put it in the fridge. The calcium water that I made back in the fall actually, and it was still perfectly good. The Pomona's label says that if you keep it in the refrigerator and the calcium powder is at the bottom of the jar and the water itself looks clear, then you know that the calcium water is still good to use. And that was the case for my jar of calcium water. So I've used some yesterday to make some cherry jam with this recipe, and now I'm going to add some to the strawberry mixture as well. And once I do that, my jam will also be ready. And I'm just going to stir that a bit more. And it will be a bit liquidy right now. It should set up a bit more, especially once you put it in the refrigerator. It'll solidify a bit more, but it should start to get somewhat gelatinous for you just from the mixing. So there's my strawberry freezer jam. It's hard to see, but it's somewhat gelatinous, and I have nice chunks of strawberries the way I like it. If you are using Pomona's pectin, or if you're using another kind of pectin that maybe has, more than the recommended 1.7 ounces of pectin, these will store at room temperature. I've just put mine in Ziploc bags, both my calcium powder and my pectin powder, and I keep them in the box so that I know what they are. And they will store for as long as the date on the box says, as long as you keep them sealed and keep them in a relatively cool, dry place. You don't necessarily need to freeze it. Room temperature is perfectly fine as long as it's in an airtight container. On this document, I also have the chia freezer jam recipe that you're welcome to try. I made some of that yesterday as well. This is some strawberry chia freezer jam. It didn't get quite as thick as the pectin jam I made, but it still spreads nicely on bread. It's also maybe just a little bit healthier, especially since you could even cut out the sweetener altogether, but notice that for about the same amount of fruit, you're only looking at 1/3 of the amount of sweetener compared to the Pomona's pectin recipe, and even less than that for the regular pectin recipes. So this is my strawberry chia freezer jam. The chia seeds get nice and soft after time. I made this yesterday morning and had some later in the afternoon on bread, and the seeds, you could tell they were there, but they really weren't any crunchier than a strawberry seed. And this is the cherry jam I made yesterday from the Pomona's pectin recipe. It got nice and sweet. The cherries were much sweeter than the strawberries, so between the fact that this calls for more sugar and the strawberries were less sweet than the cherries, this jam got pretty sweet, but it was really good when I tried it this morning. The main difference with the chia freezer jam is just that you cook the berries for about 15 minutes with the water and the maple syrup and the lemon juice, and then you remove it and you add a couple of tablespoons of chia seeds and let it stand until it cools, and then check the consistency and add a teaspoon of vanilla. If it's not quite as thick as you might like it to be, you can add a little more chia seeds. I only needed 2 tablespoons for mine. My strawberries weren't super watery, so 2 tablespoons seem to work well, and it spreads nicely. And then you can use the freezer jam. You can freeze it really for up to a year. You can keep it in the fridge. I think that as long as it's well refrigerated and sealed, it should keep for several weeks usually. It goes well on toast. It goes well on vanilla ice cream. It's nice because I really like strawberries with ice cream, that I can freeze the jam now and later I can get it out and have some with vanilla ice cream late in the summer. And that gives me an option. So the jams are nice for that, but there are other things you can do with your berries other than just freeze them for later or make jam. Here I have a sauce recipe. It's nice as well. I've done this with both berries and cherries. We're not going to make this recipe today, but it's available for you to look at. It's pretty easy to do. And you could freeze this as well in a freezer safe container. Again, making sure you leave that 1/2 inch at the top for expansion. And that goes well on ice cream too, or you can put it on cheesecake, different kinds of desserts, anything that you might like to have a fruit sauce on top of, it would work well. And you can keep it in the freezer for a while and enjoy your fresh local berries and cherries for an extended period of time. I also just want to share several more recipes before we finish this up very quickly. That's the same one. Let me just get the other document here. And we can talk a little bit about these last recipes. So here, the one on the right is baked oatmeal. I've used this recipe with various kinds of fruit, with apples, with berries, cherries, peaches. any kind of fruit that you might like, and baked oatmeal will freeze for you. It will get a little bit soft as well, but it's nice to be able to make when the fruit is in season. And then you've got snacks for lunches. You've got something you can pull out for a quick breakfast or mid-morning snack later in the season. So I like to make baked oatmeal when the fruit is local, and then eat some of it immediately and freeze some of it for later. The main thing I would say is that that and anything else you might bake with the berries or the cherries, muffins, breads, cakes, just make sure if you're freezing in layers that you put wax paper or parchment paper in between, and put them in a sealed freezer tight container. I have frozen, this is a baked oatmeal I made with banana and chocolate chips, and I froze some of that. I just froze these in Ziploc bags as well, but I've also frozen them in rectangular containers and then just put the wax paper or parchment paper in between. And it's just a little bit softer than it initially was when I baked it, but it's still easy to manage even with like a napkin. So if you wanted to pack it for school lunches or anything like that, it would be doable. And then the other thing is less for later than to enjoy now, but you can make your own fresh berry parfaits. Obviously, you can put berries on top of ice cream, fresh, if you like that. But you can also make a fresh berry parfait, like the one I have here on the screen. And you just need to have your fresh berries, some plain yogurt, maybe some granola, and if you want to, you can drizzle some honey or maple syrup or other sweetener on top. And you just basically layer your yogurt, your berries, and your granola, yogurt, berries, granola, and then drizzle the sweetener on top. I also have a recipe here for homemade granola that I like. The thing I like about this granola is that I can mix up what I do and use different kinds of nuts and seeds depending on what I'm in the mood for. But it also doesn't call for a lot of sugar. There's just a little bit of maple syrup or honey, and so it's not super sweet. So if you wanted to try making your own granola, it doesn't take very long, especially if you have nuts that are pre-chopped. You just mix all of those ingredients with the oats and bake for 10 minutes at 300, and you've got a quart of granola that you can use for snacking or for eating with your fresh fruit and yogurt parfait. So those are all of the recipes. And that pretty much concludes the program. I hope that you found some things that have been helpful. I just have several takeaways for you to think about. Hopefully, if you've gotten nothing else from this program, that you've learned that you should wash your berries and your cherries in a solution of 50-50 vinegar and water and rinse for 20 seconds, and that's all you need to do, other than to wash your hands before and after. You can freeze fruit raw. You don't have to do anything to it other than wash it and pat it dry and put it in freezer safe containers. But you can also make jams and sauces, muffins, breads, baked oatmeal, other things that you like with fruit can also be frozen. You don't have to go through the tedious canning process in order to be able to save these fruits for later. Like I said, I've had blueberries that I've kept for almost a year, and I'm going to continue to eat those over the next several weeks. And the jam now I've got that I can freeze to enjoy for later as well. Thank you for joining the program, and I hope to see you for the next Seasonably Good program in July.